Welcome to the Teach Travel Adventure podcast. I'm your host, Jamie from ESL Teacher 365. Today's guest is Nick Kendell, who has been involved with international schools for over 30 years and has spent the past 12 years working with Search Associates, which is an international school agency. If you're curious about international schools, then this episode is for you. Thanks, Nick, so much for joining me today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jamie. It's great to be here.
What are international schools and what makes them different from teaching in your home country?
So two parts to that question. I guess the first part is what are international schools? And international schools, the dynamic has changed over the last 30 years in the time that I've been involved. International schools were previously schools set up by expatriate citizens in various countries to educate the students of the expatriate workers who are over there so that they could get an education in a Western environment and then head on back to universities in their home countries. They've evolved over time, and international schools are now still offering a Western-style curriculum, but for a more diverse population of a student body. So the students now come from all over the world, plus many from local countries as well. And their main aim is to get this education in this Western-style environment so that then they can go over to universities in places like the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, and so on. How do they differ from schools in our own countries or here in Australia in particular? The fundamentals are basically the same. They run from pre-K to year 12 or year 13 in some cases. The modem of language is usually in English, or it's a bilingual school with the international schools that we work with. They have teachers from all over the world. I guess the major difference would be the diversity of the population, and the demographic of the student and teacher body is incredibly diverse, whereas in a lot of home countries, Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, you might not have that same broad demographic of student body and teaching body as you would in an international school.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned that some of the schools are bilingual. How many would you say are going to be bilingual schools?
Research tells us there's about 13,000 schools around the world that call themselves international schools. We work with about 750 at Search Associates. And of our 750 schools that we work with, I'd say under 10% would be the bilingual category. But yeah, that's just a rough estimate. And I would say that's probably fairly true across the board. Around 10 to 20% of the international schools would run a bilingual program.
What qualifications do teachers need to work in international schools?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question. I think it differs from place to place. And it's really changed a little bit since COVID. Because some countries have tightened up on the regulations of visa requirements. Mm-hmm. For the most part, if you're coming, and I'm guessing your main audience is going to be in Australia and the region, but if you're coming from Australia or New Zealand, if you have a Bachelor of Education or a Bachelor of Teaching, that would be a sufficient qualification to allow you to work in the majority of international schools around the world. The same goes for secondary teachers. If you have a graduate diploma or a postgraduate in teaching, that would also allow you to work in international schools and obtain visas. Caveat on that is that some schools are now requiring, if you're teaching a certain subject area, you need to have a degree or qualification in that particular subject area. So that's changed a little bit over the last 3 or 4 years. The other thing is teaching certification. And I know that's a big thing in the US. You can have
yes.
statewide certification, not as much here in Australia or in New Zealand, but I know there are teachers' registration boards in various states around Australia. So if you have your teacher's registration, that means that you've had police checks. It means that they've gone through your qualifications and you've met all the requirements to be able to obtain that teacher registration. While you're overseas, you don't necessarily need to maintain that. It is helpful if you can, but in some places, when you're overseas, it's very hard to go back to your home country or your home state in whatever country you're in and maintain that particular qualification unless you go back and sit an exam or keep a portfolio of work, and some of the portfolios aren't accepted from international schools. So I guess the main qualification you'd need is the Bachelor of Education or a bachelor's degree. Masters are also highly recognised as well in international schools, but the bachelor's degree is the minimum requirement for most educational institutions with whom we work.
Okay. Yeah, I can share a little bit about the US side of things. So you're right, like each state has its own teaching certification. So typically you will study something, you'll also do teacher education, and you'll get your teaching license in that subject. And you've usually had to take an exam called Praxis. So like I'm a certified Spanish teacher. I took the Spanish Praxis, and then I have my license for mine's actually 0 to 21 years. It's kind of strange, but for teaching Spanish. And then you're right, like maintaining this while you're abroad is a bit tricky. So for me, I renew my teaching license. I think it's every 4 or 5 years, but I can't really get to the next level of it because you would have to be doing that in the US. But if I'm applying to teach in international schools, at least I have maintained that certification. Yep. If you're in a place like the UK, I think it's QTS is kind of the similar qualification. So yeah, it really depends on your home country. But I guess would your advice be maybe if someone's interested in doing this, kind of contact a university in their country to see what the typical qualifications are for a teacher in that country?
I would think so. The UK also will recognise a PGCE, postgraduate certificate in education.
That's right.
Just to add to it, there are still some schools, because the international schools are independent bodies, and if the country allows it, there are still some schools who will allow you to teach in their schools without teaching certification. So it's important to note that that just because you don't have it might not mean that you can't get a job. So important to remember that there are some schools who will look at your experience and look at the practical side of your background, and they may be able to accept you anyway. A lot of it, though, depends on the visa regulations in countries as well.
Where have you taught abroad, and in which roles?
So I started, both my wife Paula and I are teachers. We taught in schools in Victoria, and I taught a range of grade levels. I'm a primary school or elementary school educator. When we first went overseas, I taught grade 4, and I taught that for a couple of years and then moved into a grade 5 class or a year 5 class. And from there, I went into an instructional technology role, helping schools with, or helping our school with technology integration. And that was at Hong Kong International School in Hong Kong. And we signed on for 3 years there and ended up staying for 10.
Oh, wow.
I then came back to Australia and took over as a senior admin role in a private school in Tasmania. We were there for 4.5 years and weren't looking to go back overseas, but an opportunity came up in Egypt, where I went over as a head of school or primary school over there. And we were there for 3 years, and I was a head of primary there. And then I moved into the role with Search Associates.
Fun fact, Nick and I were both there during the revolution. So I've shared a bit about my story, my evacuation story. I'm sure you have your own evacuation story, but oh, that was a wild time.
It was a wild time. And especially for us with kids, we were told there was an evacuation flight going out, and we had about 3 hours to pack a bag. 7 kilos was all we could take as a carry-on.
Oh my gosh.
And get to the airport, and off we went, not knowing if we'd get back or not.
For when you're teaching abroad, like, I don't know, now after that experience, I always recommend like having an emergency plan, having a backup plan, because you never know what's going to happen.
And it's funny, I don't know about you, Jamie, but the evacuation plan we had in place at our school was virtually rendered useless because it relied on a phone tree for mobile phones, and they cut off the mobile phone network. So and our evacuation plan relied on us having access to banks, and they all shut. Travel agents all shut. So the best laid plans didn't work out as we expected to.
Yeah, mine was, luckily I had given my mom in the US my landline. And so she was able to call. I was there through a scholarship. She was able to call the scholarship and they were able to get me an evacuation flight. But yeah, you're
Wow.
right. Even having a plan sometimes
Yeah, it didn't work out that well.
goes out the window. In your opinion, what are some of the pros of teaching in international schools?
Yeah, look, I could go on for hours about the pros. I guess that's probably my sales pitch. But for us, I guess the pros were the communities that you work in are incredible communities. They're tight knit. They become your surrogate family while you're overseas. And you make lifelong friends because you're with people who are in a very similar situation to yourself. They've come in not knowing anyone in the country, and people band together and support each other. So the communities in international schools, for me, are probably one of the biggest benefits of living and working overseas. Because if you're leaving your home country, you give up a lot. You give up your network of friends, you give up the lifestyle that you're used to. And going into a foreign place where you may not necessarily speak the language, you don't know much about how to get around, you've automatically got a network of people there to support you in all those endeavors. So that's probably a real plus in international schools. Another one is the ability, and in Australia and New Zealand especially, we're fairly isolated from the rest of the world because we're so far away. And the ability to travel when you're in an international school it's tremendous. So if you're in Asia, you can jump on a flight on a Friday night and head off to 5, 6, 10 different countries, be there late on Friday night, leave on Sunday and back at school on Monday morning. If you leave anywhere from Australia or New Zealand, it's an overnight flight, unless you're going to either Australia or New Zealand, it's an overnight flight. And you've got to plan, a lot of things to get there. So travel is a great one. The professional development in the international schools with whom we work with at Search Associates is incredibly valued. It's very highly valued. Schools really want their teachers to be lifelong learners, and as such, they provide opportunities for them constantly in professional development. So you can continue to grow as an educator while you're overseas. And just being in a community with people from various backgrounds is incredible professional development in itself. I went over as a teacher who'd been teaching for 6 or 7 years. I thought I knew everything about elementary education. And suddenly I found myself in a team with people from the US, from Canada, from the UK, one from Africa, and just the learning that takes place in team meetings. I became a sponge, just trying to suction in all this information and knowledge that these people from various educational backgrounds had. And that was fantastic PD in itself. And I guess one of the other things is we find very few candidates go overseas and are financially worse off than they would be in their home country. And that's a benefit in itself, is that if you can get ahead financially, it's not the be all and end all, but it's a nice bonus as a teacher to be able to live and work in a different community and environment, build up your nest egg while you're there is a big bonus. And I guess living and working in a culture that's not your own is a real eye-opening experience. And you would have seen a lot of this when you were in Egypt, Jamie, is the people are fantastic people in the countries. And if you immerse yourself in the local environment and culture, it's a truly rewarding experience. So there's a lot of benefits to teaching in international schools. They're just a few of them.
It's true that it's just a different kind of life, and there are sacrifices that you make in terms of leaving people behind, but I think it's worth it. And if you love to travel and you love teaching and learning, I don't see anything that's better than teaching in international schools and teaching abroad.
Yeah, we're pretty lucky as being part of that career path, because, when I came out of teachers college, I didn't think that would be my career path. I saw myself as being an educator in Australia, and I didn't really know about international schools. And people still don't. People say,
still don't.
Is that like teaching English in Japan? And well, it kind of is, but it's a little bit more than that as well.
For anyone that's a teacher, even if you just take, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, I think it's worth it. But I don't know. I find that once you kind of go abroad, you just kind of want to keep going abroad.
And I think nowadays, there's so many I's you've got to dot and T's you've got to cross, and so many legislations and regulations, which are great, but they take over from your time with kids. And that's what we all became teachers for, is to work with students and to try and help them. And international schools, I think, provide you the opportunity again to get back to just teaching, to be an educator and to be a really important part of students' lives and the lives of families who are in international schools, which is hugely rewarding.
What would you say are some of the cons?
Yeah, I guess we touched on a few of them there with the you give up a lot. You give up a lifestyle, and you might give up some of the freedoms that you have in your own country as well, depending on where you go in the world. Not every culture treats people the same as we do in some of the countries that we live in as a regular basis. So you've got to be prepared for those cultural differences and be prepared to live and work in an environment that sometimes there are things going on that you might not necessarily agree with. So that's a big one. Another thing is, I guess in the time that we've been overseas, we've lived through bird flu, we've lived through SARS, we've lived through a revolution. We've seen around us military upheavals in countries, we've seen invasions. So when you go overseas, there's no guarantee that these things won't happen. So I think one of the things that you've got to be prepared for is to be flexible and resilient. And that's really important as an international school educator. Another thing is that things don't always work the same in other countries. And, I look at Egypt, for example, which we loved Egypt, and it was a fantastic country and has an amazing history and cultural diversity. But things don't always work the same as they do at home. And you can't get frustrated because that's the way things work in that country. And, we used to talk about Egypt time. And, you'd get your washing machine would break down and the washing machine repair person would be due to come on Tuesday, and you have someone waiting for them on Tuesday, but they don't come, and they ring you back and say, well, we didn't say which Tuesday we were coming. Another time we used to pay our electricity bill through one of the guys who lived downstairs and helped us, our BOAB. And we used to just give him some cash. We had no idea what it meant because we couldn't read it. And he'd say, you owe this much money, and we'd give him that much money. Well, he went away on holidays, and apparently we didn't pay our bill one month. And the electricity department came and
they cut off.
Well, they didn't just cut it off. They removed the whole switchboard.
Oh my gosh.
and I was looking downstairs, and he was putting this whole big switchboard in the boot of his car. And I was like, so not everything works the same as it does while you're here. So that's definitely something that you've got to get used to. We tell all our teachers who go overseas, expect to be challenged, like mentally, emotionally, physically, and you go through this roller coaster of emotions when you start working in an international school. And you've got to be prepared for that as well. But then, once you start seeing a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, and you might start seeing a few extra dollars in your bank account at the end of each month, and the opportunities to travel and the people you're working with become your close friends, things pick up pretty quickly. But just getting over that hump can be difficult as well.
How does Search Associates support teachers who are looking for jobs in international schools?
Yeah, so I guess there's a number of different companies that work with international schools. And look, I've from what I've heard, and I don't know all of them, but most of them do a pretty good job. So you've got some choices. And I guess if you're going to make informed choices, talk to people, find out who's used these organizations before, and then decide what's best for you. For Search Associates, you're connected with an associate. So that's probably one of the big differences that Search Associates has from a lot of the other organizations, is that you have an individual who will be there to answer your questions, to support you through your job search. I'm constantly going through CVs, helping people create a CV that might be successful for them. I help people with their cover letters. I have conversations like today when we finish here, I've got 6 Zoom conversations with candidates, just finding out a little bit more about them and having that personal approach. And I think that's the thing that really sets, I hope, what I do apart from what maybe some other organizations are doing. We're not just a job board. We're more than that. Having said that, we're not a bespoke organization who match schools to candidates. And there are some organizations who do that. We don't. We have a database of schools. which has a wealth of information on all the schools that we work with. And that's probably the biggest benefit, apart from having people like me. That's probably the biggest benefit of going with an organisation such as Search, is that you have access to a bunch of information on schools, and that can include projected salaries, what your savings potential might be, what your benefits are, how many days a year you'd be working, how many days of the professional development, what sort of curriculum the school runs, where is the school located, what's the demographic of the student body in the school, what's the demographic of the staff, where do they come from, and a bunch of other information that really helps you narrow your search. Will they take single teachers? Do they employ teachers with kids? All these sorts of things can be found out in the search database. And then the schools also have access to a candidate database, which includes a fairly lengthy profile on each candidate, which includes confidential references, work history, your educational background, hobbies, interests, all sorts of things. So schools and candidates find each other via this database, and we sort of act as the middle person in between. And in doing that, we're the conduit that connects the schools and the candidates together. And I guess the biggest benefit that I see is we have in-person job fairs. And if you're looking to go overseas and you can get yourself to an in-person job fair, I would highly, highly recommend it. It can exponentially increase your chances of finding a position in an international school. Just putting yourself in front of 20, 30, 40, 50 schools over a weekend is incredibly rewarding. It can be a great professional experience, even if you don't walk away with a job. But you can make lots of connections, and international school recruiters have long memories. They remember people who they've interviewed at these things. So it may be that you are offered a job right away. It may be that you are offered a job 2 years down the track, but meeting with people in person can be a huge benefit. And I had one recruiter say to me recently, it's much harder to turn someone down face-to-face than it is in an email.
Yeah.
So, you might send out 20 emails and not get a foot in the door. If you are at a fair and you meet with 20 people, we would almost guarantee that you'll get interviews. We have one in Singapore in November, and we've got one in the Middle East in Dubai later in November. We then have one in Melbourne in January. We've got one in Bangkok in January, one in Hong Kong in January, one in London, one in Cambridge in the US, in Boston, and then one in China, another one in London later in the year, and another one in Dubai. So you've got a fair choice of locations as to where you can go to one of these fairs. To attend a Search Associates fair, you do need to be a registered candidate, though.
You get one job fair a year. How does that work out?
Yeah, you get included in your registration fee. You get one job fair included in that. And if you want to go to a second, you'd pay a nominal fee to go.
When teachers are looking for jobs in international schools, what are some things that they can do to help them stand out?
Going through an agency helps you stand out because you have an automatic in some ways. And whether that's through Search or another agency, they have relationships with schools. All the agencies have relationships with schools. So that can be one thing. The second thing is have a CV that is concise, informative, and hits the key points that you want schools to know about you as an educator. Schools are getting hundreds of applications for each position that they advertise. They don't want to read a CV of biblical proportions. They just won't.
Yeah.
When I was a recruiter, if anyone gave me a CV that was longer than 3 pages, I just didn't have time to go through them all. In your cover letters, it's really important when you write a cover letter to a school to personalize that cover letter and individualize it to the school that you're applying to. And an example of that would be you can have a base cover letter that you send to multiple schools, but do a bit of research on each of those schools that you're sending it to and include things that resonate with you as an educator. So it may be that you say, I looked up your mission statement, and your mission statement talks about your service learning program in great depth. That's really important to me because I've been involved in service learning in my current school by running this, that, and the other. or it might be, I notice that your after school program is really rich and diverse in the opportunities that are offered to students. I've run after school programs in my own school. These are the sorts of things that resonate with schools. They want to know that you're applying directly to them rather than sending out generic applications. And the other little thing which we forget is include the name of the school you're applying to a number of times in your email, at least 2 or 3 times in your cover letter or email, whatever you're sending to schools.
Yeah.
It just reinforces you're applying to that particular school. The important thing there is, as it would be in reports, when you're copying and pasting some of your report comments from one year to another, make sure you change
be careful.
the school to the school that you're applying to, because we've all done that in the past, or use the correct pronouns, he, him, they, them, she, her, or whatever you're using. Make sure you adapt them to each individual application. So there's some of the things that you can do. The other thing I think that schools are really after is educators with a can-do attitude. So people who will put their hand up and accept responsibilities that may not necessarily be right in their wheelhouse in terms of what they've done previously, but they're willing to sort of maybe step out of their comfort zone a little bit and do something a little bit different. So being able to articulate to schools that you're adaptable, flexible, that you've got a number of different strings to your bow is also really important.
So Nick helps people that are based in Australia and New Zealand. Search does also help teachers from other countries, but is it kind of office by office depending on your location?
A little bit. Australia and New Zealand, anyone who applies through Australia or New Zealand will be directed to me, but I also work with teachers who are coming from all over the world. Okay. So if you're already in an international environment, not necessarily an international school, but if you're living overseas, you can choose your associate and you don't necessarily have to go to an associate in your region. Mm-hmm. In the US, we have associates who will work with people in different states. So we have regional based associates, same in the UK and Canada, but the rest of the world is pretty much open, so they can apply to anywhere. And because I run the Bangkok Fair, anyone who wants to go to the Bangkok Fair usually comes through our office. Anyone who goes to the London Fair will go through one of my associates' office. Same with different fairs, the Hong Kong Fair, they'll go to the Hong Kong office, and so on and so forth. We work with people from all over the world. I guess my predominant region has always been Australia and New Zealand because that's the area I'm from and familiar with, but I'd say probably 60% of my candidates now are not from Australia or New Zealand.
Okay. Good to know. Well, if people want to get in contact with you or Search Associates, what is the best way to do that?
Yeah, the best way is to reach out via email. You can go to the Search Associates website. So it's searchassociates.com, and you can look at the associates there. All of our emails end with @searchassociates.com. So mine would be nkendell, and that's Kendell with KENDELL @searchassociates.com. Just drop me an email. Even if you're not in my region, I can direct you to where you need to go. I'm sure Jamie will have my details somewhere as well.
Yeah, so I'll put them down in the description.
Yeah, she can also pass them on. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, we have a little satellite website, anz.searchassociates.com. And that has a bunch of information that's relevant to anyone in the world. It has resources. It has a heap of information on international schools that if you're an avid and vivacious reader, it will fill in many hours of your day reading about international schools and some of the things that are associated therein.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks, Jamie. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you for doing what you're doing to promote international education around the world.